My name is Kenneth Tupper. I'm an adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia. I'm also Director of Implementation and Partnerships with the BC Centre on Substance Use, a new health system organization in the province of British Columbia, where we do health professional education, clinical care guidance, and scientific research in the area of addictions. I want to speak to you about the limits of quantitative research, so not so much about qualitative research, but non-quantitative research, and talk to you a little bit about why I think, although the scientific pursuit of understanding about psychedelics is tremendously important and valuable, it also has some limitations that we need to be aware of. And I'm going to go through a bit about why that's the case. So just a bit about history and philosophy of science. You know, the word science comes from the Latin term scientia, which had a much broader meaning prior to the sort of early modern scientific revolution, when issues of the post-Lutheran concerns about religious dogma and religious wars were being fought in the 16th, 17th century. Post-Columbian uncertainties about geographic understanding of the world after discovery of the so-called New World. And post-Copernican understandings of the model of the universe not necessarily being geocentric as it had been previously thought. And that along with all these sort of shakings up of understandings about knowledge came amateur intellectuals who were deploying new kinds of tools to extend the limits of human perception, and they were called at the time natural philosophers. Eventually became known as scientists, but that was a little later in the sort of development of this new kind of experimental methodologies that were being deployed. And quantification was a really important part of that, and I'm going to explain a little bit about how that came to be. Just some examples of some of the transformations in thinking where astrology became sort of the quantified science of astronomy. Alchemy turned to metaphysics, alchemy to chemistry, metaphysics to physics. Political and social philosophy ultimately became, or in many directions it went, but economics is one of the important ones. And then psychology, the sort of scientific study of the mind, in several different kinds of schools: psychoanalysis, functional psychology, behavioral psychology, and developmental psychology. But I want to explore a slightly less known branch of psychology called cultural historical psychology that was developed in part by a Soviet psychologist named Lev Vygotsky, whose work wasn't translated into English until the 1960s. The cultural historical school of psychology considers how an individual's mind changes or develops with use of specific kinds of cognitive tools through which one acquires facility via socialization and enculturation. So Vygotsky described human mnemonic, symbolic, and behavioral techniques as activities directed towards the mastery of one's mental processes, one's own or someone else's, just as technical devices are directed towards mastery of processes of nature. So examples that he had were works of art, mnemonic techniques, coded numeration and counting, reading and writing, so encoded language or music, arithmetic and algebraic symbolism, maps, globes, schemes, diagrams, and blueprints. Those are all his examples. I would also add psychedelic drugs to the inventory of cognitive tools, and I'll explain a bit more about why I think that's a helpful way to think about these kinds of tools. So another way to think about cognitive tools is as essentially a symbolic or cultural mediation between the mind or the world, and that certain forms of knowledge or understanding may be predicated on facility with particular kinds of cognitive tools. An abacus is a good example where learning to use an abacus actually reshapes your neural architecture. The same is actually true of reading and writing. Studies of people who grew up in cultures illiterate or without literacy in traditional societies where literacy wasn't part of their cultural tradition. Their ways of conceptualizing the world are somewhat different than cultures where literacy is part and parcel of growing up. And I want to go through how numbers developed in a kind of sequential way in a form of subsequent cognitive tool developments that had a kind of ratchet effect where their deployment we couldn't ever go back, but we kept going forward into sort of forms of knowledge and thinking that have very much shaped our understandings of the sort of most valuable kinds of knowledge that we hold in political circles and economic circles today, but might be leaving us with a bit of a blind spot to other kinds of knowledge that I think we should be paying attention to. So a bit about the history of numeracy and counting. So tally sticks are one of the earliest examples of a kind of cognitive tool, keeping track of debts, essentially making little notches, splitting the stick apart, and then two parties to some kind of debt could bring that back together to have a record of what it was that they were keeping track of in terms of these kinds of quantified obligations. The very first reading, writing, and numeric counting happening around Mesopotamia around 3000 BC. Originally not so much for encoding language on pure numbers, but it was really about keeping track of debts, again, very sort of rudimentary counting of things like seeds and cattle that were being traded back and forth. And this was ultimately, of course, a very revolutionary technological development and developments in alphabetical language and numerals. Different kinds of numeral systems existed back then, but I want to fast forward to the introduction of the Arabic or Hindu numeral system, 0 through 9, which we all just take for granted as the standard numbers that we all use. Relatively recent invention, 600 to 800 AD in India, but not introduced to Europe until the Middle Ages, around the 12th century, where prior to that Roman numerals had still had a legacy of ways of counting. And this was actually tremendously powerful development in European intellectual history, in that arithmetic became much simpler. The positional notation system of the decimal 0 through 9 allowed for things like algebra, calculus, and accounting. And accounting, little did I know, reading a book called Double Entry, How the Merchants of Venice Created Modern Finance. I urge all of you to read it. It's a fascinating history of accounting. Who knew? But modern accounting invented as double entry bookkeeping by merchants in Venice. Pacioli was one of the most famous. It allowed for the economic transactions to be simultaneously represented as credit and debit, so two sides of the ledger, the red and the black. It had theological and cosmological resonances, invoking the symmetry of God and symbolism in the scales of justice. But it also revolutionized not just commercial activity, but natural philosophy or early modern science, and was part and parcel of the creation of the epistemic unit of the fact. So I'd ask you to check out Mary Puvi's book, The History of the Modern Fact, to see the impact that early modern accounting had on the development of scientific mathematics and our understandings of epistemology at the time. So as I mentioned, from this early natural philosophy, the clockwork or mechanistic model of the universe was starting to develop, and quantification and empirical experimental phenomena began approaches to measuring things like space, time, energy, economic inputs and outputs, intelligence, and populations. And some of the developments in mathematics that were important were the emergence of probability, where the word probable used to mean believable. It was implied approval or acceptability by intelligent people. So opinion for belief from reflection, argument, or disputation. The word probability actually shifted in the 1660s with people like Blaise Pascal developing mathematics for calculating gambling sort of issues that were emerging at the time. I mean, gambling had been around for thousands of years, but the applied mathematics to gambling problems and odds ratios developed into essentially modern probability theory. And it was applied, this new kind of epistemology of risk and probability was applied to population demographics and what was called social arithmetic, and led to the development in a few hundred years of statistics, when the modern nation-state enterprise, Prussia being one of the most early examples, and it's no coincidence that the word state and statistics have the same etymological roots, began counting things about their populations. And Ian Hacking, a philosopher who's written about this, talks about the avalanche of numbers that began in the 1820s and 1830s when states began really counting things in earnest and publishing sort of long lists or inventories of different types of facts about populations, including not just births, deaths, and marriages, which had been sort of counted previous to that, but things like suicides, physical illness, mental illness, etc. and starting to realize that these things had patterns that were not like, it was very troubling that things like free will, whether someone chooses to end their life or not, is actually follows in populations a relatively interesting, predictable pattern. And this, out of this, Gaussian distribution was determined in terms of the bell-shaped curve. And with that was the creation of the concept of normal in a way that's a very interesting bridge between the is or the ought, or the prescriptive and descriptive. So normal is both a description of how things are distributed in that bell-shaped curve, but it also became a kind of how things ought to be, that normal is both a fact and a value. And normality applied to human psychology then very easily allowed us to look at deviance, especially deviant states of consciousness, as something to be pathologized rather than previously, for example, moralized as heretical, such as the burning of witches at the stake. So with the advances of psychology as a science and the introduction of new types of understanding about pharmacology in the 1950s, there was a sort of real interesting tension between the sort of normal states of consciousness that were taken for granted and these new, very altered states of consciousness that were emerging through the discoveries of psychotomimetics, as they were really understood in some of the early research in the 1950s, that these drugs could help mimic psychosis. Although it wasn't universally accepted that this was the best way to look at it, so the word psychedelic was actually coined as an alternative to provide an understanding that these could help reveal the mind, that it wasn't just a pathology necessarily or a pseudopathology, but there were potential therapeutic or even non-therapeutic benefits that could be brought about by the psychedelic experience, including spiritual, educational, or cognitive enhancement benefits. At the same time with scientific research, there was a movement going on completely independent of the psychedelic research that was happening towards the randomized control trial, the double-blind gold standard in medical research, in part through the Kefauver-Harris drug amendments in the United States, which was partly a reaction to the thalidomide scare. So this is where it was taking the antibiotics approach to understanding medical applications and medical benefits from drugs, where the urge was to take out all extra pharmacological factors that were seen as extraneous to therapeutic efficacy. And so there was a big battle, and I'd refer you to this article by Matthew Oram called Efficacy and Enlightenment, looking at some of the tensions that existed among some psychedelic researchers, many of whom were resistant to the application of the randomized control trial methodology, arguing that this didn't quite work very well for the kinds of therapeutic approaches that they were trying to take and the kind of outcomes they were seeking, that just applying this randomized control, sort of manualized approach, and that a placebo was never going to be effective because the blind would be so easily broken by for both the subject and the researchers. However, and statistical modeling of the outputs created authoritative knowledge about the drug effects through this approach. But the impetus to recognize psychedelics not just as drugs like antibiotics that you could drug in, output X. There were others, as I said, who were interested in exploring other potential applications of these things for cognitive enhancement purposes, arguing that psychedelics were in some ways tools equivalent to telescopes or microscopes. And so people like Timothy Leary, Alan Watts, Aldous Huxley were making these kinds of comparisons. And it's interesting that if you think about early modern science, and as I mentioned earlier, there were amateur intellectuals who were deploying new kinds of tools, extending the limits of human perception, very much to the chagrin of the epistemic authorities of the day, i.e. church fathers, where these things were happening outside of the medieval scholastic institutions, which were very much bound up with the church at the time. And the tools that they were using were things like telescopes, microscopes, clocks, theodolites, and in many cases the church fathers didn't want to look through these telescopes. They were quite convinced that the epistemic authority that they had was well grounded in reading texts like Aristotle or the Bible, and that these newfangled tools didn't need to be looked through. So it's interesting to consider how the impetus to need to look through a tool might be something valuable in a form of gaining knowledge, and whether self-experimentation is something that we should be considering in the world of psychedelic research. So it's got a long history in psychoactive substance research, including going back to Arab alchemists who discovered distillation of alcohol, Humphrey Davy's experiments with nitrous oxide, or at the time it was called phlogisticated nitrous air. Of course, Arthur Hefter discovering mescaline, and William James' experimentations with nitrous oxide. So the impetus towards objectivity in science emerged in the late 19th century with things like photography helping to sort of further distance subject and object, and to remove the scientist or the observer from what they were regarding in terms of their research approaches. And this is when self-experimentation began to be regarded as suspect or even delusional, not acceptable professional practice. But the question that I'd like to raise is psychedelic empiricism challenging this need for or desire for objectivity? Is first-hand knowledge desirable or even necessary for psychedelic researchers to establish empathy with research subjects, to validate interpretation of data, to participate in emerging discourses of intersubjectivity, which may not lend themselves to quantification? So this is where I want to sort of tie back the idea that, you know, the impetus to quantify and do rigorous analytic experimental research and statistical modeling on the results. I don't want to discount that that's important and valuable, but to recognize that there may be other types of knowledge that are valuable that we have sort of culturally forgotten. And I'm speaking more from my experience working within government, where the currency of you know, what is going to be valuable for advancing arguments for political decision making is essentially what gets published in a peer-reviewed academic journal, ideally a sort of top-ranked medical journal that, you know, is most likely to publish works that are based on quantitative research. But, you know, it was in doing research with ayahuasca and asking the question, you know, if I was running a lab administering ayahuasca day in, day out for 20 years, I had literally thousands of subjects coming through and had all the latest scientific equipment to be making all kinds of measurements. But after a 20-year program of research, I myself, as the researcher, if I have never drunk ayahuasca, what do I really know about ayahuasca? It's an interesting question. I think it's an interesting epistemological question that we need to think about. You know, to what degree is personal experience actually important, and is there a kind of knowledge that comes about from that that just can't be gotten through all the kinds of quantified objective scientific research that we take for granted as critical. So Nashe talked a little bit about ineffability of the psychedelic or entheogenic experience. Not only is it difficult to quantify, I think it's even difficult to verbalize the experiences that we go through. But of course we're left with not much else than language to try to communicate, so we're stuck with it. But I think it's important to look to other forms of knowledge in traditional indigenous cultures as something that might be of value for us to be humble in a sort of post-colonial way, instead of assuming that the modern Western scientific approach is the be-all and end-all. And in fact, I would almost want to say, you know, why is it that modern Western quantitative science is the touchstone for epistemological validity? Couldn't traditional indigenous knowledge authorize the finding of science rather than the other way around? You know, these are interesting questions, I think, that we need to, especially when it comes to doing research on something, a traditional indigenous medicine or sacrament like ayahuasca or plant teacher. You know, the sort of ontological issues that come up for people who drink ayahuasca, encountering sentience or beings that are very sort of troubling when you're sort of Western materialist, but find, you know, you're coming to contact with experiences and, say, entities or sentient beings that appear very much real, and I think it behooves us to consider whether the indigenous perspective on this might not be very well informed after hundreds, if not thousands, of years of experience in this area, and that our impetus to come in and sort of impose a Western scientific framework might not be the only way. I don't want to say that it's not valuable and it's important, but I think that we also need to balance our hubris in taking the assumptions we have about the value of our own ways of knowing and understanding, and maybe dropping them down a notch, and opening up avenues for other types of understanding and research. So with that, I'm going to leave it there and welcome any questions anyone has.